So what I'm doing here, I'll explain more in a moment, but I'm going to just jump across some different examples. And I've taken this title, which I'll explain in a moment or two. And this image, by the way, is from Avengers Age of Ultron. It's a little screen grab of the moment when the Hulk is fighting Iron Man, who's wearing I think it's called the Hulk Stopper or something like that, wearing a huge Iron Man costume. And there's a moment where they punch, and the two fists come together, and there's this huge sort of vibration happens, where two completely unstoppable things collide. And I'm not really going to talk about Iron Man or Hulk, though I would be very pleased to do so as the evening goes on. But it was just watching this with my kid in the cinema and just sensing the power of that punch between two things which essentially couldn't be moved, that just struck me as one potentially appropriate image. So I'll read some of this. I don't know how long it is. Warning, it contains poetry, so I know that's not everyone's thing. It's not my poetry, you'll be relieved to know. But it's partly a way of, the examples I'm using are a way of opening something up, and I'm coming at it in this instance through the examples of certain poems rather than necessarily through art critics or through art theorists or anything like that, though such figures do turn up. So I've called the talk In Praise of Extremity, though I'm not sure that's precisely what I'm going to be doing. I'm not necessarily just praising extremity. But I want to reflect on a certain kind of extremity, a certain concentration, I think, of extreme forces within art. And at the risk of being very vague, I want to discuss a tendency I'm attracted to in certain art that I come across, or a certain experience of art that occurs in certain settings, perhaps, sometimes under very particular conditions. So this tendency or experience involves a sense of things cohering, converging, coming together in some new configuration, and yet at the same time seeming to explode in entirely unexpected ways and entirely unexpected directions. This is what I mean about being abstract, as I set off here, so these aren't exactly very concrete claims. But what I'm referring to, in a way, is a kind of uncommon internal concentration in the apprehension of an artwork, and also something which is extreme in its external effects. So, the picture of Hulk and Iron Man, and I'm concerned with types of extreme collision that are critical to art's realization and impact. We might think of this then as a simultaneous contraction and dilation, or as a coincidence of powerful centrifugal and centripetal forces. This is so abstract, and I'm not even sure what the physics of that means to talk about centrifugal and centripetal forces occurring at the same time. But there might be ways to think of this simultaneity of these things, this convergence of these contradictions, in ways that at different times are psychologically or phenomenologically or even ecologically and politically interesting. And maybe that's where this needs to go further on, to further develop the implications of these very slight and abstract observations. So I'm principally, anyway, this evening kind of worrying away at some paradoxes as I encounter them in works of art, pondering a kind of coincidental push and pull that creates certain kinds of extreme tension within an artwork. And I'm not arguing that this tension is the basis of great art, but I think a lot of great art has it. And it's important to note too, I think, that any sense of great art is dependent, for me at least, on wider contextual tensions, rather than being exclusively something intrinsic, rather than something being about qualities that we hear in a work as we encounter, or about only that. So anyhow, I want to ponder this meeting of extreme forces in different ways in relation to a fairly wide range of examples. In some ways, it's a kind of wholly ridiculous range that I'm introducing here, which also means then that there's no particularly kind of coherent narrative. Rather, this is a kind of selective, kind of eclectic way of noting an emphasis, and maybe that's all, of identifying the appearance of different kinds of pressures within different kinds of artworks. A comment from Robert Smithson comes to mind. There's no perfection in my range, because my thoughts, as well as the material I'm dealing with, are always coming loose, breaking apart and bleeding at the edges. But in dealing with these diverse examples then, I found myself considering some unexpected convergences, so perhaps there's some useful tensions in that regard. Two final points then. One is most of what I say here is probably stating the obvious. It's probably so obvious as to be really dim-witted, you know. And so apologies if I'm in that regard insulting your intelligence. But I might note too then that in advocating a certain kind of extremity, there's a discussion to be had, I think, about to what extent we might observe these kinds of pressures, these kinds of tensions and forces in the art we see around us at present. And again, maybe this is a conversation that might arise out of this that I might be interested in at least. I don't see it enough, right? I don't see a great deal of art happening in Ireland at present that actually excites me as much as it should. And there's a lot of really exciting art here, but I think there could be a lot of work which goes a great deal further and cranks up something much, much more intensive. Didn't really crank up in intensity, but you get the idea. So there's a worry at the heart of this as well as an excitement in regard to certain types of work that I see around. So, okay, as I warned, I'm going to start with a poem, and it's one that's a pretty kind of cosily familiar one. Does that come up okay? Yeah, so it's Heaney's Postscript from 1996, and I picked this partly because the first time I read this, I'm pretty sure I was sitting at the desk in Temple Bar Gallery Studios, right? Okay, so I had a copy of Heaney's Spirit Level, published in 1996, which I was sitting reading while I invigilated here. And when I read it, like many other people read it, I read it as uplifting. Right? And I'll read through it now. And again, apologies for reading poetry. Some people take to this, some people it makes you want to vomit. But anyway, so Heaney Postscript from 1996, and he said, "And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore in September or October when the wind and the light are working off each other, so that the ocean on one side is wild with foam and glitter, and inland among stones the surface of a slate grey lake is lit by the earth lightning of a flock of swans." Sorry, there's a typo there. "Their feathers roughed and ruffling, white on white, their fully grown, headstrong looking heads, tucked or cresting or busy under water. Useless to think you'll park and capture it more thoroughly. You are neither here nor there, a hurry through which known and strange things pass, as big soft buffetings come up the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open." So it's a poem about being in a place, experiencing something of its intensity, something of its immediate power in a particular moment. But I think it's also a poem, well, it's clearly also a poem about the impossibility of being in one place and the impossibility of capturing something. It's a work which, in both very free and studious ways, centers and separates, positioning the viewer, the protagonist in one place, and creating an impossible to fathom plurality in that place. This is most obvious perhaps in the second part, with the emphasis on how we are ourselves a hurry. You are a hurry through which known and strange things pass. The person in it is not a fixed and stable being. So we see that the way that plays out. But I'm interested in the very extreme ways in which Heaney actually takes this remembered experience, this moment apart, to the point where nothing appears to be consistent with itself. just as a single situation is being held in writing. Language declares the importance of the moment and also becomes undone in doing so. So, if we look just more closely, we're now in poetry class, look at the way in which he breaks up this experience in a micro way. He says, sometime make the time. Time is already split into in the first sentence. And then we get a sense of the place. We go out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore, right? So already there's 3 different senses of being in place. After that then, we are in September or October, right? The wind and the light are working off each other. There's something about the vital tensions of that place which is apparent. So that the ocean on one side, we are splitting this place up, and on one side there is wildness, and within the wildness there is foam and glitter, and then and inland, not just on the other side, again among something else, the place is further broken up into something else. The surface of a slate grey lake, and the slate grey is not just a grey lake, it is 2 kinds of things. The words are breaking open, right? Is lit by the earth lightning, so it is both earth and light in the one moment of a flock of swans. And here again, language starts to come apart further, where the feathers are ruffed and ruffling, almost the same word but separate. The next part of that sentence is the same word, different. White on white. One white is different to another white. So at this point in this thing, when we get there to headstrong looking heads, the things which should be consistent with themselves have been taken apart, right? So everything about the manifestation of being in one place is about separation, dispersal, cracking things open, right? So then there's more oars and so on, and then we get the more declarative moment, useless to think of park and capture. The thing that's declarative, the thing that's confirmable, is the fact that nothing can be confirmed, right? So, we can even then go to another stage with this. The last 2 lines, big soft buffetings come at the car sideways and catch the heart off guard and blow it open. I had this read at my wedding, right? And in the years afterwards, since reading it, the sense of sort of unambiguous uplift in the poem, maybe this is what years of marriage does to you, have started to seem stranger and stranger, to the extent that you come to notice how in a poem written in 1996 during the peace process, we have the words of something being blown open, a car catching the car sideways and blowing the heart open is not an uncomplicated thing to talk about at a moment where we're experiencing the wind down or the working through of a conflict, right? So more interestingly, that's just not anecdotal or incidental. There's another poem in the book called 2 Lorries, which includes these lines: time fast forwards, and were you to fast forward in that book, you'd go right to the end, of course, where postscript is positioned. Time fast forwards and a different lorry groans into shot up Broad Street with a payload that will blow the bus station to dust and ashes. So the blowing that happens at the end of the book, earlier in the book, is the explosion that is conflict and catastrophe and everything else, right? So the thing about Heaney's poem is that it contains the possibility of exhilaration and uplift and epiphany, but it also seems to be working with other more dangerous material, more worrying material. So I'm interested in the way this happened, essentially. Right? I'm interested in the way in which something which is about a kind of epiphanic encounter with place is also something which is about dispersal, explosion, and which contains an implicit sense of violence within the way in which this experience is articulated and thought through. So I'm interested here in how this kind of writing concentrates on the specificity and intensity of a situation. A sonnet, which this is of course, is classically in Wordsworthian terms, a moment's monument, right? It's a sense of the monumental within time, while also producing this extreme explosive force that might be benign or not so benign. I'm interested in its commitment then to the epiphanic encounter with place and the dispersal, dissipation of this epiphanic possibility within language. Language itself disperses the possibility of the confirmation that might be evident within the poem. It's an ostensibly inspiring piece, but it's also forceful, even violent in its ambiguous outcome. So one potentially useful point of reference here, I think, used elsewhere by Heaney, is to Wallace Stevens' notion that the nobility of poetry, he says, is a violence from within that protects us from a violence without. That's a really striking and alarming way to talk about art, right? That it's two kinds of violence. Or it's the encounter between two kinds of violence. In a related way, Heaney's also spoken of how poetry might be considered, and I like this line very much, an extension and refinement of the mind's extreme recognitions and language's most unexpected apprehensions. I like this line partly because this is something which is about not just extreme recognitions. Art isn't just extreme recognitions, it's an extension and refinement of extreme recognitions. It extends the extremity, and it somehow sort of distills extremity, which I think is an interesting thing. And then it's coupled with language's most unexpected apprehensions, as he puts it. Anyway, so extending these recognitions then, considering how such a contained, formally ordered piece of art, within such a contained, formally ordered piece of art, there's both extreme inward attention and extreme outward force. Another reference comes to mind, which is Elizabeth Bishop's little poem, Sandpiper, from 1965. So this is a little longer, right? I'm not going to read this through, I don't think. You can just about see that, I think. Maybe I will read it through. Sorry if you don't like the poetry being read aloud. So the Sandpiper, the roaring alongside he takes for granted, and that every so often the world is bound to shake. He runs to the south, finical, awkward, in a state of controlled panic, a student of Blake. The beach hisses like fat. On his left, a sheet of interrupting water comes and goes, and glazes over his dark and brittle feet. He runs straight through it, watching his toes, watching rather the spaces of sand between them, where no detail too small, the Atlantic drains rapidly backwards and downwards. As he runs, he stares at the dragging grains. The world is a mist, and the world is minute and vast and clear. The tide is higher or lower, he couldn't tell you which. His beak is focused, he is preoccupied, looking for something. Per bird he is obsessed. The millions of grains are black, white, tan and grey, mixed with quartz grains, rose and amethyst. I don't know whether you know Bishop's work, but she's amazing. She's a really amazing, interesting life. Colin Turbine has just published a little book on her work, which would be worth a look. Here we can observe the attention to tiny micro detail, and we see how that's undertaken within the forces of the Atlantic, as it drains rapidly backwards and downwards. Right? So there's this little bird dealing with little things on the beach, but the thing that is washing around its feet is the full effect of the Atlantic Ocean. It's that expanse against that microscopic kind of experience. Bishop's poem is one of great nuanced observational delicacy, but its interests and effects arise out of the meeting of extreme forces. The poem is generated as a convergence of these forces, but look to how it opens out, how it explodes. It contains the combination of obsessive looking for something, and those millions of grains that are black and white and tan and grey mixed with quartz grains, rose and amethyst. Inner preoccupation meets a kind of outer convulsion or expansion or multiplication. So, poetry bit over. Those of you who have been dozing off can wake up again. So, in thinking about and experiencing art over recent years, There have been a number of occasions when a strongly related sense of extreme contradiction, of dual contraction and expansion, has seemed vital, just merely in the actual experience of seeing things, of encountering them, and registering them in the moment, I suppose. Sometimes this has been an experience of being quite surprisingly centred in front of something, newly fixed in position by an artwork, while also being made to feel neither here nor there. This is again what I mean about these things needing a further critical elaboration rather than to talk in these sort of loose terms. But a number of examples come to mind in this regard. Now one of these, which perhaps might be everyone's favourite artist, is Richard Serra's The Matter of Time at the Guggenheim in Bilbao. Has anyone seen this? Yeah. So this is work which I had the misfortune or good fortune to see while experiencing a truly shocking hangover. It was absolutely a really disturbing experience, pushing me to that. And shamefully, while sitting in Temple Bar, my hangover was the result of being on a stag weekend in Bilbao as well. So words that you don't ever want to hear in Temple Bar Gallery Studios, I'm sure. But among the things that I think are extraordinary about these 8 torqued ellipses that constitute The Matter of Time is that they assert themselves over you with such extreme force that you become absolutely aware of your own body in relation to them. This is, of course, one of the outcomes of art within the slipstream of minimalism. They are huge, heavy, you are small, vulnerable, especially with a hangover. They have an almighty, overwhelming steel solidity that feels like it could crush you any second. There's the massive sculpture, and there's you. The binary is clear, the hierarchy non-negotiable. They might be definitive in a way that your own experience of the world is not. They will probably outlast you. And yet they have an entirely contrary character too, essential to their extreme effects. Serra has said that he was concerned less with making one definitive sculpture than with making an entire body of work, and when he built more and saw the effects of different angles of incline, different lengths of passage, different closures, turnings, and so on, he could construct relationships between major and minor axes and control the degree of differentiation. Indeed, there's so much differentiation here that it sometimes seems as if these things are moving through space, and in time they seem to sway and flow. They don't seem to be static objects within the space. And that's also undoubtedly an effect of the hangover, you know. But they have that, you know, capacity to do that. So you stop being sure where you are within these structures. You stop being sure of your own scale. You stop being sure of where, you know, your own bodily limits, perhaps. Time and space open up. And I'm not really overstating this, I don't think. Whatever my previous thoughts of Serra had been prior to seeing this was an entirely overwhelming art experience. One of a small number sometimes that we get in life, and often the very best ones are with hangovers. And Peter Sheldon talks about this at the beginning of his collection, Let's See, where he talks about going to see Las Meninas in Madrid, getting off the plane, going straight, you know, to the Prado in Madrid, with, you know, in the kind of red-eye state, and then getting in there and feeling that he's actually hallucinating, and he can see the characters of Velasquez as being actually moving about. He talks about having an auditory hallucination where he can hear the dresses moving, you know. So this is the benefits of extreme hangovers as much as extreme anything else. So, so Serra says about these things that everything on both sides of you, right and left, up and down, changes as you walk. I can't help thinking again of Healy splitting apart of this landscape in that poem. Everything right and left, up and down, changes as you walk, and that either contracts the time or extends it, making you anxious or relaxed as you anticipate what will happen next or recollect what has just happened. There is then a crucial coincidence of possibilities in what you encounter here. You're still grounded in the concrete place of that experience. Serra says, experience can be internal, psychological and private on the one hand, and external, social and public on the other. So experiencing this feels, in a way that one might be familiar with from thinking about Richard Serra's work: violent, forceful, extreme, and so on. And maybe particularly with my Hulk and Iron Man image at the beginning, we need to be wary of a slightly kind of macho sense of some of this forcefulness. But I think there are other ways in which we can find this kind of power in artworks that doesn't have to use that language of steel and structural potency of that kind. So a second very different example that comes to mind then, it is also one of those situations of encountering an artwork and suddenly finding oneself rooted to the spot in an entirely new way, and is with Kathy Wilkes. She's Pregnant Again from 2005. Now this is a work which at that time utterly bewildered and slightly infuriated me, but it's stuck around, it bothered me. And it is a work that once again, in which there's both the impression of concentration, positioning the body in space in a recognizable relation to objects, and an uncanny separation from coherent self-possession. Wilkes creates a space in which a life seems to be scattered, dispersed through its relationship to objects that are at once recognizable and suddenly alien. We might think of her approach to space, objects and bodies within the zone of an installation as serving to prompt what some theorists, such as Simon O'Sullivan, responded to Deleuze and Guattari, like to think of as the encounter of art, an artistic encounter. So in an essay on Kathy Wilkes, Simon O'Sullivan writes, with an object of recognition, which he contrasts with the object of encounter, we are reconfirmed and reaffirmed as that which we always already understood ourselves and our world to be. In such a place, no real thought takes place. An object of an encounter ruptures this self-confirming mechanism. It operates as a cut that itself functions as a mutant centre of subjectification, a singular point around which a different kind of subjectivity might constellate. An encounter is then an event that, as well as rupturing one world, opens up another. In this, I like the language of something being both a singular point and also the opening up of a world, another world. So we're getting, again, this sense of something which is maybe contracting and dilating at the same time. And again, apologies for this rather abstract language. The encounter is thus an encounter of crucial, singular specificity and of revelatory expansiveness. So for Wilkes, though, other kinds of dualities and diversities, other tensions are at the heart of her work. Okay, we'll show you the Kathy Wilkes clip. The thing the reason I want to show the Kathy Wilkes clip is that she talks about her work according to two different sets of tensions. One is the tension between things as they're represented and things as they are, borrowing Nietzsche's idea of midday as this really crucial contrast between two different possibilities of looking at things. And then the second is the really crucial tensions around proximity and distance, between contact and separation. And these things, these two different dualities, are at the core of her work.
Nietzsche's figure of midday is a model that I've used to try and understand what objects mean for me. He describes the event at midday where the shadows of objects sit on top of those objects and are not visible as something outside the object.
It's weird to find that film split in two.
Yeah, I think it's probably to the thing.
Yeah. So as I was saying, that in her way of speaking and thinking about her work, there's this combined interest in the duality of the ready-made, the thing that exists as it is, and also as it is representing or functioning within the artwork, which suggests some sense of a kind of, drawing together and drawing out of those two possibilities. And similarly then, the really interesting example she uses, which is channeled into her working process around the touch and contact and pressure and release and so on, around the separation of something from the body, pushed away or withheld, and so on and so on. So I think she's exceptionally interested in this regard, an incredibly reticent sort of practice that's at the same time one which, you know, signifies in a very plural way, for want of a better word. Okay, so there are great tensions in this work, I think, extreme tensions between inner and outer worlds. I mean, other artists who I would have liked to talk about in this instance have a different sensibility, but whose work I think kind of combines some of these sorts of anxieties and pressures, or someone like Isa Genskin, whose work has a much more kind of, you know, trashy, punky sort of carefree kind of manner, but it is nonetheless, I think, you know, work which concentrates on relationships with the human form in many instances, and on, you know, the place of that form within the wider convulsions of you know, consumer culture, or the wider contemporary reality. But I won't really talk about is against me. The artist I would like to talk about for a moment, partly because, as well, having just seen a new show for work in Venice, is Sarah Lucas. But I'm going back to 1996 again, when, you know, I was working at the desk in Temple Bar Gallery, and around when I would have encountered work like this, the self-portrait with fried eggs from 1996. So it's a really famous piece of art associated with this sort of aggressive manner of some of the young British artists. This work, though, you know, coincidentally for me, kind of coming at the same time as reading that poem Postscript in 1996, allows me to perhaps make the first ever convergence of Seamus Heaney and Sarah Lucas. I don't think they've ever existed in a sentence together anywhere. And I think at the same time there's something from Heaney that comes to mind as I think again about the particular style of Lucas's Extremity. Talking about the Polish poet Zbigniew Herbert, Heaney praises a pronounced combination in this artist's work of extremity and equanimity. Heaney quotes Herbert talking about Piero della Francesca to identify important points about Herbert himself. He says the harmonized background and principle of tranquility and the epic impassiveness of Piero della Francesca. Well, these are qualities, Heaney says, that derive something from his unblinding stare at the facts of pain. And somehow I find these words appropriate to the artist Sarah Lucas, which in part discovers its extreme effects through comparable dualities. The coincidence in this picture between harmony and hostility, for instance. There's a centering of a studied individual within an organized visual structure, and a subversive shattering of coherence at the same time. A provocative appropriation and abrogation of pornography's fragmenting of the female form, or of coarse public language's manner of doing that. So I think it's just, the way this image is striking is partly because of the chessboard floor, and, you know, and her entirely composed, confrontational, without being too confrontational, disposition in front of the camera. I think that phrase, that combination of extremity and equanimity, is one which has perhaps a kind of applicability here. So in other works, other exhibitions by Lucas, there's a related convergence of obsessive kind of homeliness, or tidiness, or decorativeness, or even ornamental qualities, with brutal, twisted, convulsive content. And the work develops its power from this extreme combination. So this was a show. No, this was from different shows actually. This one on the right here, it is, as I recall, from the Whitechapel exhibition. The ones on the left, one might be from St. Cole's, one from upstairs in St. Cole's, I think. from a series called Situation. But so some of these things look like they might be, you know, an entirely sort of hellish, horrific IKEA or more like Habitat kind of shop. You know, it's the kind of, and it's the combination of the sort of, you know, repressed dimension of homeliness and the you know, the sort of pristine decorative dimension, which is one of the interesting aspects of her more recent work. Okay, I'm going to begin to draw towards a conclusion by pointing to another example which suggests other ways in which these kinds of considerations might extend out into the world a little more, or a little in ways other than I've already identified. And one of the kind of critical, you know, critically sort of celebrated artworks of recent years that I think applies here will be Until by Pierre Huyghe from Documenta 13. Again, we're finding something which offers a particular kind of rooted positioning, you know, determined concentration and closing in around a particular locus. And yet, it's a kind of work at the same time which is about an uncontainable expansion beyond the presumed limits of an artwork. So if one thing to consider, some of the things that I've been talking about have been merely about the sort of subjective apprehension of artworks in exhibition contexts or the phenomenological relationship with things and spaces. We might also imagine this combination of extreme forces that I'm talking about as being something which can be considered in an art historical context in terms of the relationship, the transition from a modernism which primarily addresses the intrinsic concerns of art to something which is more about art's expanded relationship to the world, and something like Pierre Huyghe is a more assiduously expanded version than arguably had often been encountered up to that point. A quote from Elizabeth Gross came to mind when I was thinking about this earlier. She says, art, like nature itself, is always a strange coupling, the coming together of two orders, one chaotic, the other ordered, one folding and the other unfolding, one contracting and the other dilating. So, how many of you saw this? Yeah. And so, what's extraordinary about it in a way is the fact that it was a simultaneous construction and deconstruction, the way that it, you know, set up a situation and also it implied a situation which, you know, was kind of beyond the regulation or management of organising art. Within all of this, there's forces, there's convergences of forces which are out of the reach or out of the understanding of the artist. So raising questions of new kinds about the way in which we might imagine.
Just expand on that. Is that because of the bees or because things can
partly the bees, partly kinds of termites and ants and ladybirds and psychotropic plants, and you know, it was a
the dog as well.
so the dog and the guy who minded the dog, and you know, and all of these things were wherever the artwork was sort of boundaried, you know, in a loose way, but at the same time there were living things which existed, you know, in relation to the breeze and in relation to the changing climate and in relation to pollen and all of these sorts of things. So it sort of proposed itself to the world as being something which, you know, was open to all of that, which was engaging with all of that. Okay, so I'm not going to take that further. I had another point or two. I mean, perhaps the sort of ideal work to talk about in these circumstances really would, in terms of the kind of art historical way in which we could think about this convergence of opposing forces, would be in something like Spiral Jetty as a sort of trigger moment, or critical converging moment when this mattered. Spiral Jetty is something which is an artwork in a piece of land art in a landscape, and something which exists as something which marks territory in a particular way. It coils in and centres and marks the turning in towards something. But at the same time, it does it in a landscape which has different kinds of temporalities associated with it. So it marks a landscape of industrial ruination in a way, a place where industry has damaged the terrain, but it intervenes in a landscape which is geologically ancient. So its relationship with time is both a relationship to modern time and geological time. It's also something which exists in not just as that coiling into a piece of earth, but something which expands out into a text, an essay, and into a film. And the artwork, crucially, is not anything if it's not all those things. A quote from Peter Osborne I might as well read while we're just considering this. Peter Osborne says, "Viewed from the perspective of a post-conceptual practice, the film Spiral Jetty appears as one element in a complex distribution of artistic materials across a multiplicity of material forms and practices, the unity of which constitutes a singular, though internally multitudinous work. In this case, Spiral Jetty includes both the film and the configuration of mud, precipitated salt crystals and rocks that coil 1,500 feet long and 15 feet wide, jutting out into the water at Russell Point in the Great Salt Lake in Utah, as well as the essay of the same name, which includes script from the film and a variety of related paraphernalia." So the thing about this is, it's a very dramatic instance of something which is obviously a marked landscape, noting the convergence of something in a space, and also something which is entirely multitudinous, expansive, and extreme in the way in which it undertakes to bring all of those different things together or open all of them up. Going back to the very beginning and to that sense of place described by Heaney in that postscript poem, we're talking about something there which is about, being in a place, noting the conditions of that place, registering the experience of that place, but then also kind of creating something which extends in a way that can't be entirely kind of controlled or contained or whatever else. And to go back to that other slightly, concerned point about the art that I see out there more broadly, maybe in just this anecdotal way, what I'm looking for more is a sense of something really, really critically extreme, or psychologically extreme, or culturally extreme, somehow kind of being wrestled with and being exposed or being tested within the artwork. And sometimes what we find is I think today, not just locally but more broadly, a very soft conceptualism which doesn't have the pressure in relation to the cultural context that certain kinds of conceptual gestures might once have had, or we find certain kinds of gestures that are but perhaps could be kind of pushed further, testing some sort of limit. So I don't know what your thoughts and experience are of these kinds of worries are, but I just wanted to talk through in this loose way some of these emphases, some of this interest in how things converge within works, and what sense of tension we might expect from a work of art, what level of extremity we might have experienced in the most sort of powerful work that we've encountered. So I'll leave it with that kind of question, if it is a question. So that's all really.